They came for my car, not in some quiet civil way, but with authority, with flashing lights in the driveway, with a sense of entitlement that made my blood run cold. I had watched my neighborhood slowly twist into a place ruled by petty rules and hidden agendas, but this crossed a line I didn't even know existed. One moment my car was parked safely in my garage. The next, HOA Karen was shouting at me like I had committed a crime, calling authorities as if she owned not just my driveway, but my life. It wasn't just about a car. It never is. It's about control, about a neighborhood association that thinks rules exist to intimidate, to dictate, to humiliate anyone who dares to own a little freedom. I'd tried to stay under the radar, to comply with every obscure rule, to ignore the endless fines and inspections. But there's a limit to how much humiliation a person can endure before something inside snaps. I remember standing there, heart racing, watching her point fingers and make threats, watching the neighbors peek through their blinds, unsure if they should intervene or stay silent. The fear in that moment wasn't mine alone. It was the fear of every homeowner trapped in a system designed to bully. My mind raced. What could I possibly do when the very people charged with maintaining order had become the enforcers of chaos? But then, in the midst of her triumphant yelling and the sound of tires rolling, a thought struck me. I didn't have to play by their rules anymore. I didn't have to live in a world where someone else dictated what I could or couldn't do with my own property. For the first time in months, maybe years, I realized I had options, and some of those options could change everything. I looked around my garage, at the cars I had worked tirelessly to afford, at the space that had always been mine, and a dangerous, exhilarating idea began to form. What if I didn't just protect my car? What if I took control of the whole lot, of every inch of the space they thought they could manipulate me over? It was risky, insane even, but there's a certain clarity in moments of desperation, a sharp focus that turns fear into strategy. Every fine, every complaint, every moment of humiliation had led to this instant, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. I didn't speak, I didn't move, I just watched, heart pounding, as HOA Karen made her demands, each one more absurd than the last. The tension was unbearable, electric, like the air before a storm. I could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on me, their curiosity mingling with my own anticipation. Something big was about to happen, something that would turn this neighborhood upside down. And in that moment I realized I had a choice: continue to bend under their tyranny, or step up and reclaim everything they thought they had power over. What I did next would shock them all, but it would also change the way they viewed me, and perhaps the way this neighborhood had always operated. By the time the sun set that evening, everything had shifted. The balance of power, the rules, the fear. It was all about to be rewritten. But how far would I go? How much was I willing to risk to take back what was rightfully mine? And could one person really outmaneuver an entire HOA hell-bent on control? The answer was about to reveal itself in a way nobody in this neighborhood would ever forget. Before the chaos, before the threats and fines and angry phone calls, life in my neighborhood felt ordinary, almost comforting. Nestled in a quiet suburban stretch, lined with neatly trimmed hedges and the soft hum of sprinklers, it was the kind of place people imagined when they thought of community. Kids rode bicycles along the sidewalks, neighbors waved when they passed, and Sunday mornings carried the warm smell of fresh coffee mingling with cut grass. My home fit right in, a modest yet proud house tucked in the corner, its garage doors painted a crisp, welcoming white, and a driveway wide enough to hold the cars I loved and worked for. I had lived there for years, building routines, friendships, and a sense of security. On weekdays, I went to work, returning home to cook dinner, unwind, and spend evenings in the quiet comfort of my living room. Weekends were for small adventures, trips to the local lake, weekend barbecues with neighbors who'd become like extended family. The occasional block party where laughter spilled into the streets. Life was structured, peaceful, and predictable. And in a world that often felt chaotic, that predictability was something I cherished. Yet, beneath the calm surface, the community was not without its quirks. HOA meetings were held monthly in a well-kept hall at the end of our cul-de-sac. On the surface, they seemed innocuous. Votes on landscaping guidelines, repainting schedules, minor maintenance updates. But there was always a faint edge to them, a subtle tension that suggested these small rules were tools of influence, not just governance. Certain neighbors thrived on enforcing them, while others quietly bristled at their growing authority. Everyone knew someone who had received a fine for a minor misstep, or worse, had been quietly threatened into compliance. I had watched these dynamics unfold over the years, aware yet detached. I played by the rules, kept my property immaculate, and avoided conflict whenever possible. I smiled politely at the HOA president during meetings, nodded at complaints that seemed petty but necessary, and kept my distance from the unofficial enforcers in the neighborhood. It worked. Life stayed calm. Until that day, the first hint of trouble was subtle, almost laughable in retrospect. A small flyer slipped under my front door announcing new garage and driveway regulations, a long list of do's and don'ts that read more like suggestions for perfection than enforceable rules. At first glance, nothing seemed alarming, but as I skimmed through, one line caught my eye, sharp and commanding. All vehicles must be registered with the HOA. Any unauthorized vehicle may be towed at owner expense. I laughed it off at first. My cars were all legal, insured, registered, and parked neatly in my garage. Surely this couldn't be a problem. But that simple line planted a seed, a hint of tension that would soon grow into something far larger than a rule on paper. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes in the neighborhood. Certain neighbors began to eye my driveway more intently. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of HOA Karen, a woman whose influence in the community seemed disproportionate, staring from across the street, clipboard in hand, jotting notes as though she were surveying my every move. She had a reputation. Known for her strict enforcement of rules and a flair for dramatic complaints, she wielded authority like a weapon, always ready to pounce on perceived violations, and she had made it clear she enjoyed the power, no matter how trivial the issue. Tried to ignore it. I focused on my daily routines, on family dinners and weekend outings, but slowly, a creeping unease began to settle in. Phone calls from anonymous neighbors, vague warnings about community standards, and whispered comments about taking responsibility suggested that my peaceful life might not stay that way for long. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Someone was gearing up to test boundaries, to assert control, and I was in their sights. Then came the first overt warning. I returned home one afternoon to find a brightly colored notice taped to my garage door. Bold letters screamed, "Violation, unauthorized vehicle." My heart sank. I had checked the regulations, reviewed my paperwork, and double-checked every car in my garage. Everything was legal, everything compliant. Yet the message was clear. Someone had decided my property was up for scrutiny, and the consequences could be immediate. I felt a rush of disbelief and indignation mixed with a creeping sense of dread. How could a simple, everyday life be so suddenly upended? The unfairness of it was staggering. A community that I had loved, a neighborhood I had invested in, suddenly felt like a battlefield, and I had unwittingly become the target. As I examined the notice, I caught a glimpse of HOA Karen across the street, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning as though she were measuring my reaction. That was the moment it became personal. This wasn't about safety, aesthetics, or community standards. This was about control, about proving a point, about watching someone else squirm under the weight of rules enforced not with reason, but with malice and meticulous attention to Trivialities, I realized almost immediately that ignoring it would only embolden her. Compliance would signal weakness, but defiance carried risks, financial penalties, legal threats, public humiliation. Yet as I stood in the driveway, absorbing the weight of the notice and the glare of scrutiny, a spark of determination ignited within me. I refused to be intimidated. My property, my cars, my home, this was my domain. And if someone wanted to turn it into a stage for petty power plays, they would have to contend with me. From that moment on, life in the neighborhood began to shift in ways I could never have anticipated. Every minor interaction, every casual glance became charged with tension. The community I had known, the calm routine I had treasured, was dissolving into a series of subtle battles, each one escalating the stakes. And in the center of it all, my garage, my cars, and my sense of autonomy became a flashpoint for a conflict that would shake the neighborhood to its foundations. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The rules, the fines, the whispers, the glances, they were just the surface. Beneath it all lay a storm of petty authority, manipulation, and ambition, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, I would have to decide. Would I bend under their control or fight back in a way that would leave an entire community stunned? The first fine arrived on a crisp Monday morning, its envelope bright and accusatory on my doorstep. The words, "Violation, unauthorized vehicle," were printed in bold, official-looking letters, but the details were absurdly vague. There was no citation number, no specification of which vehicle was in question, and yet a $250 penalty loomed, with threats of further legal action if I didn't comply immediately. I stared at the notice, disbelief and frustration clashing. Inside me, I had double-checked every document, every registration, every sticker, yet the letter suggested I was in the wrong. And worse, it felt deliberate, targeted. This was no mistake. This was strategy, a subtle but relentless assertion of power. I could feel it in every word. Someone was testing me, nudging me toward fear and compliance, waiting to see how far they could push before I snapped. But I refused to play along. I took a deep breath and drafted a response, outlining every detail, every proof of compliance. I delivered it in person, standing at the HOA office, while the receptionist gave me the kind of wary look that suggested this was not the first time someone had dared to push back. For a moment, I thought the confrontation might end there. Perhaps reason would prevail, but it didn't. That same afternoon, I found another notice on my windshield, a warning about improper garage organization, complete with photos of my vehicles parked neatly as if an arrangement of cars could constitute a crime. The language dripped with condescension, implying negligence and disobedience. I felt my blood boil. Who spent hours scrutinizing other people's garages for mistakes? Who treated property ownership like an invitation to control every detail? It quickly became a pattern. Over the next few days, my driveway, my garage, even the small patch of lawn I had carefully cultivated, became arenas of relentless oversight. HOA Karen seemed to appear everywhere at once, clipboard in hand, surveying every angle as if she had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner. At times, I imagined her eyes peeking through windows when I wasn't looking, cataloguing every movement, every object, as if the very act of living in my own home could be turned into evidence against me. The fines escalated too. Minor infractions ballooned into formal complaints. One day, it was obstructed driveway because my car was parked 5 inches too close to the sidewalk. Another day, it was unapproved landscaping alteration because I had planted a small tree that, in my mind, added charm and shade to the yard. Each fine arrived with a threat of further penalties, each notice dripping with smug authority. The cumulative effect was exhausting. I began to feel as though my home itself was under siege, that the walls and doors I had once found comforting were now part of a battlefield. Every interaction with HOA Karen or the board amplified the tension. Meetings became exercises in endurance. Every discussion, every question felt loaded with judgment. I had to carefully choose my words, my tone, my posture, fearing that a single slip could become the next violation. Neighbors watched silently, some sympathetic, some wary, unwilling, to challenge the power she wielded. It was as if the entire community had internalized her control, a quiet, insidious force that dictated how people could exist in their own homes. And yet, amid the harassment, a strange determination began to build in me. The unfairness, the absurdity, the blatant abuse of power, it stoked a fire. I realized that if I did nothing, the cycle would continue indefinitely, and HOA Karen would only grow more audacious. I began documenting everything: photos of my vehicles, copies of every notice, timestamps, and notes of every conversation. Every fine became evidence, every complaint a testament to the pettiness of the system I was confronting. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about reclaiming dignity, autonomy, and control. And in the back of my mind, a plan began to form, one that would turn the tables in a way nobody in the neighborhood could ignore, but the escalation was relentless. One morning, I returned from work to find my mailbox vandalized, its door ripped off and thrown into the grass. A note had been pinned to it with a pushpin: "Follow the rules or face consequences." The handwriting was unmistakable, aggressive, and taunting. Fear and anger surged in equal measure. This was no longer about fines. This was intimidation. My neighbors whispered about similar incidents. Others swore they had seen HOA Karen lurking near the cul-de-sac, making notes, observing, orchestrating. Every day brought new micro-battles. The garage, the very heart of the initial dispute, became a stage for surveillance. Photos were taken, measurements scrutinized, and every arrangement of my cars was criticized. I had to park strategically, adjust angles, and even consider leaving the garage empty for fear of creating another violation. Each adjustment felt like a small surrender, yet I refused to let it break me. And then came the confrontation that changed everything. HOA Karen issued a formal notice of intent to tow one of my cars, a simple, mundane vehicle, legally registered and parked in my garage, suddenly became the focal point of a high-stakes showdown. I received the tow notice via certified mail, an official-looking document with a timestamp and threats of immediate action. The language was precise, almost surgical, designed to induce panic and compliance. I stood in my garage, staring at the car, the letter in my hand, trembling slightly. My mind raced. Could she really have the authority to tow a vehicle that was legally parked on my property? And if she tried, what would be the consequences, both for me and for the neighborhood? At large, the tension was suffocating. It wasn't just a car. It was a test of boundaries, a challenge, a provocation meant to see how far I would bend. My neighbors noticed the shift too. Conversations grew hushed, eyes darting toward my property when HOA Karen passed by. Whispers of "Did you see what she's doing now?" And "I heard she's finding him again" circulated in the background. The social pressure was immense. Community ties, once friendly and familiar, now felt like a web of scrutiny and judgment. Every passerby became a potential witness, every glance a measure of judgment. Yet with the rising pressure came clarity. I realized that compliance would only invite further harassment. Every adjustment, every apology, every attempt to placate HOA Karen would be interpreted as weakness, fueling her sense of power. If I wanted to reclaim control, I needed more than passive resistance. I needed strategy, foresight, and a bold move that would force a reckoning. In the days leading up to the potential towing, I prepared meticulously. I gathered documentation of every fine, every notice, every attempt to comply. I researched local ordinances, HOA statutes, and legal loopholes. I mapped out the timing of meetings, the routes she took, the way the community responded to her presence. Every detail mattered. Every observation could be used to my advantage. The tension reached a crescendo one evening when I saw HOA Karen standing in the street, clipboard in hand, scanning my driveway like a hawk. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew the notice of towing could arrive at any moment. I could feel the entire neighborhood holding its breath with me, the anticipation electric, unspoken, tangible. Something was about to happen, and nothing could stop the momentum building toward that inevitable confrontation. And just when it seemed the pressure could not rise any higher, the final warning arrived. An official phone call from the towing company confirming they had been instructed to remove my car at any moment. Panic collided with anger. The walls I had built around my patience and resolve trembled under the weight of imminent action. I had to act. A decision loomed. Would I bend, surrendering to arbitrary authority, or would I seize the moment and strike back in a way that no one, not even HOA Karen, would anticipate? The answer, I knew, would change everything. And as the sun set on that tension-filled evening, casting long shadows across the driveway that had become a battleground, the first moves of my counterattack began to take shape. But nobody in the neighborhood, not a single witness, could have predicted what I was about to do next. The day of reckoning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I had anticipated this moment for weeks, meticulously preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. HOA Karen had outdone herself in the build-up. Emails, fines, warnings, and now the looming threat of an actual tow. The entire neighborhood had become a silent audience to the escalating drama, their eyes darting toward my driveway whenever she appeared. And today, she had arrived with all the confidence of someone who believed they held absolute power. I watched from my kitchen window as her car rolled to a stop across the street. Clipboard in hand, she stepped out, the click of her shoes echoing against the concrete like a metronome of authority. She glanced at her watch, adjusted her sunglasses, and then fixed her gaze on my garage as though she were about to deliver a sentence rather than discuss regulations. I felt the familiar surge of anger and defiance. This time, I wouldn't just respond. I would act. The towing company had already been notified, standing ready in the wings, waiting for the nod that would turn my legally parked car into an instant casualty of HOA overreach. I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows that stretched across the driveway like silent witnesses. I carried with me a stack of documentation, proof of ownership, registration, insurance, and evidence of every frivolous fine and harassment attempt. It was a shield, a sword, and a declaration all at once. As HOA Karen approached, the clipboard clutched tightly, her expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and barely concealed irritation. I felt the tension in the air thicken. Every neighbor on the street seemed frozen in place, their curiosity and fear palpable. Some had peeked from behind curtains, others from porches, all waiting to see which way this confrontation would tip. The silence was deafening, a prelude to chaos. I held my ground as she began enumerating the violations, her voice sharp and rehearsed. Each word dripped with self-importance, each accusation carefully constructed to provoke fear. The first was about the unauthorized vehicle, then the improper driveway alignment, and finally the potentially hazardous garage configuration, an almost laughable claim designed to make compliance seem non-negotiable. I listened, calm and measured, but inside, my mind was racing, strategizing. I knew I couldn't simply argue my way out. She had the system on her side, the bureaucracy, the rules. But what she lacked was evidence of my patience, my careful documentation, and the public's gaze. I laid out my paperwork, sliding it across the hood of my car. Photographs, timestamps, official registrations, letters documenting every interaction, all of it formed a fortress of undeniable proof. Her smug expression faltered, just slightly, but it was enough to reveal the first crack in her armor. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, trying to recalibrate. This wasn't supposed to happen. She expected fear, hesitation, compliance, and instead, I had presented clarity, order, and undeniable truth. But the moment of victory wasn't yet complete. I needed more than just paperwork. I needed leverage. I had arranged for a small team of allies to observe, documenting her actions in real time. Neighbors who had quietly endured her arbitrary authority were now watching openly. Their attention, combined with the evidence I had meticulously gathered, turned a private battle into a public spectacle. HOA. Karen's tone shifted, just a fraction, from commanding to defensive. She attempted to regain control, to assert her authority with sharp gestures and pointed words, but each attempt only highlighted the absurdity of her claims. She demanded compliance while ignoring the facts laid bare before her. I countered each accusation with calm precision, never raising my voice, never losing composure. It was a performance, yes, but a performance rooted in fact, justice, and resolve. The tension escalated when she signaled the towing company, thinking that the threat of immediate action would break me. The driver's truck idled nearby, engine humming, waiting for a single command. I stepped forward, holding my paperwork high, and made it clear. Any attempt to tow this vehicle without legal justification would constitute trespassing and liability. For damages, I could see the shock on her face. This wasn't part of her plan. Authority backed by blind obedience was no match for preparation, courage, and documentation. At that moment, the neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath. The weight of years of petty power plays, of whispered threats and unfair fines, converged in that driveway. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that mirrored the tension in the street. HOA Karen glanced nervously toward the gathered neighbors, realizing that the audience she had counted on to enforce fear was now silently observing, judging, witnessing her unravel. Then came the decisive blow. I calmly informed her that I had filed a formal complaint with the city, including evidence of harassment, frivolous fines, and intimidation tactics. I had consulted legal counsel, researched the limits of HOA authority, and documented every interaction for potential litigation. The implication was unmistakable. Her reign of petty power could and would have consequences. Her eyes narrowed, lips pressing into a thin line, but I could see that the calculated confidence she had relied upon for so long was eroding. She attempted to retort, but every word she uttered was now undermined by the mounting evidence, the attentive neighbors, and the legal awareness I projected. It was a reversal of fortune so dramatic, so complete, that the air itself seemed to shift. The towing company, sensing the change, shifted in their seats, hesitant to act without clear authority. I had transformed the scenario from a simple threat into a complex legal and social trap. The power dynamic that had kept me in constant anxiety for weeks was no longer one-sided. The moment was electric, charged with tension, anticipation, and the unmistakable scent of impending vindication. HOA Karen, realizing the momentum had slipped from her control, tried one final maneuver. A pointed demand that I remove the car immediately or face enforcement. But this time, I did not flinch. I stepped forward, calmly stating that any action taken against my legally parked vehicle would constitute harassment, and that I was fully prepared to escalate through all available legal channels. The words, simple yet resolute, landed like stones in still water. Ripples of realization spread across the street. Even the quietest neighbors could sense the shift. The confrontation stretched for what felt like an eternity. Minutes passed, with neither side yielding, tension coiling like a tightly wound spring. The clipboard, once a symbol of unchecked authority, now seemed almost laughable in her hands. She attempted to assert dominance through volume and presence, but it was ineffective. My composure, documentation, and the silent scrutiny of the neighborhood rendered her tactics impotent. Finally, after what seemed like a tactical standoff, HOA Karen turned, retreating down the street with an air of begrudging defeat. The clipboard remained clutched, but her stride lacked the confidence it had carried before. The towing company pulled back, engine idling, leaving my vehicle untouched, a silent testament to the culmination of careful planning, courage, and unwavering resolve. As the last traces of tension began to dissipate, I allowed myself a quiet exhale. The driveway, the garage, the very space that had been the stage of harassment and intimidation was now mine again. But the true triumph was deeper than property. It was the reclamation of control, dignity, and agency. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of fear lift, replaced with a fierce satisfaction that reverberated far beyond the driveway. Yet even in victory, a new awareness emerged. Power had been challenged, boundaries had shifted, and the neighborhood had witnessed the fallibility of unchecked authority. This moment would not be forgotten. The echoes of confrontation, documentation, and defiance would resonate long after the sun set over my reclaimed domain. And as the street returned to its quiet rhythm, a single thought lingered, sharp and electrifying. I had won this battle, but what would come next in a community where rules, power, and petty vengeance lurked in every corner? The answer was waiting, and the next move would define not just me, but the entire neighborhood. The air felt different in the neighborhood the morning after the confrontation. The driveway that had once been a stage for intimidation and harassment was now a symbol of reclaimed control. The sun glinted off the garage doors, the cars parked neatly within, and for the first time in weeks, the space felt like mine again. Secure, respected, and untouchable. But the sense of victory went far. Beyond material possession, it was a reclaiming of personal agency, a triumph over arbitrary power, and a lesson in the importance of standing firm in the face of petty authority. Karen was noticeably absent for days. Rumors spread quickly among neighbors. Some whispered about complaints filed against her. Others speculated about internal HOA discussions, questioning her methods. The intimidation, the fines, and the harassment that had once ruled the street no longer had the same weight. The shift in power was tangible. Where fear had once dominated, now cautious respect, or at least wary acknowledgement, had replaced it. People had witnessed firsthand that her authority was not absolute, and that the community could no longer be manipulated through threats alone. For my part, the resolution wasn't only public, it was deeply personal. The relief of reclaiming my driveway, my garage, and my property was profound, but the emotional closure extended to knowing that my boundaries were no longer negotiable. I had documented every violation, every fine, every instance of harassment, and this evidence served as a safeguard, a deterrent against future attempts at overreach. Legal counsel confirmed that the HOA had crossed lines, both procedural and ethical, and while litigation wasn't the goal, the knowledge that I could escalate further gave me confidence and peace of mind. The neighborhood began to change subtly, but unmistakably. Conversations, once hushed and cautious, grew more open. Neighbors who had quietly suffered under HOA Karen's arbitrary enforcement began to reclaim small freedoms. Lawns were decorated without fear of notices, garages organized without worry of fines, and casual interactions returned to streets and porches. A sense of empowerment rippled quietly through the community, a reminder that authority is only as strong as the compliance it demands. Yet the experience also left its marks. Some residents, still wary, avoided confrontation and maintained distance, uncertain how far the ripple effects would reach. Others, emboldened by the display of careful strategy and courage, began advocating for transparency in HOA governance. I was approached by several neighbors privately, seeking advice on handling fines, complaints, and harassment. In those moments, I realized the impact of standing firm wasn't just personal. It could inspire a shift in collective awareness, a subtle but meaningful recalibration of power dynamics. HOA. Karen eventually returned, but the tension had shifted. Irrevocably, her usual posture of dominance was tempered with caution, her actions measured rather than overtly aggressive. The social and legal groundwork I had laid meant that any attempt to resume previous tactics would be met with scrutiny, resistance, and accountability. The neighborhood had seen that authority unchecked was fallible, and that preparation, courage, and calm strategy could turn the tables. Over time, life returned to a more stable rhythm. My daily routines, once shadowed by anxiety and tension, regained their old simplicity. Weekends at the lake, barbecues on the porch, and quiet evenings in the garage felt ordinary again, but with a profound awareness of the power of preparation and resolve. The driveway, once a symbol of harassment, now represented strength, resilience, and the triumph of reason over intimidation. The long-term consequences extended beyond immediate victories. HOA fines were reviewed more carefully, and some policies were amended after city officials and legal representatives highlighted procedural irregularities. Meetings became more transparent, and the collective memory of the confrontation served as a reminder that accountability mattered. Neighbors became more attentive to their own rights, more willing to ask questions, and more protective of personal property and autonomy. The ripples of one decisive stand spread farther than anticipated, reshaping the neighborhood culture in subtle but lasting ways. Looking back, the most powerful takeaway wasn't the halting of fines, the prevention of towing, or even the public humiliation of HOA Karen. It was the understanding that standing firm, with evidence, calm reasoning, and courage, can transform a situation that seems overwhelming into one of empowerment. Fear is often an illusion amplified by those seeking control. Preparation and clarity turn that fear into opportunity. The lesson resonates beyond HOA disputes. It applies to any situation where arbitrary authority, intimidation, or unfair rules threaten to dominate your life. And yet, the story leaves a lingering question, one that still echoes through the quiet streets and within my own reflections. How many people endure harassment quietly? How many boundaries are silently surrendered? And how often do we underestimate the power of standing firm when the odds seem stacked against us? The confrontation taught me that every seemingly small act of resistance, when executed with patience and strategy, can ripple into something transformative, not just for one person, but for an entire community. As I stepped into my garage one evening, closing the door behind me and taking a deep breath, the tension of the past weeks felt like a distant shadow. The space was mine again, fully and indisputably. The neighborhood had learned a lesson, subtle but unmistakable, about fairness, accountability, and the limits of control. And I knew that while the battle had ended, the impact of that moment would resonate for years, shaping not only my own sense of security, but also the collective consciousness of every neighbor who had watched, silently or otherwise, and realized that courage could rewrite the rules. The driveway remained calm, yet powerful, a quiet monument to persistence, preparation, and defiance against petty authority. And as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, casting a warm, golden glow across the neighborhood, one thought lingered. Boundaries, once asserted with clarity and confidence, are not easily erased. The fight had been hard, the stakes high, but in the end, integrity, preparation, and courage had prevailed, leaving a lasting mark on both property and principle.